Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome to the SCX Crux webinar series. Today, we're going to be going through MiniMax 2.5, but I might just do a light introduction. So, here at SCX, we released MiniMax 2.5 2 months ago, and ever since then, we've been getting a lot of positive feedback. A lot of our customers that were previously using other models have transitioned on it just simply because their A/B testing showed such better results. And also ourselves with new customers, we've always been recommending MiniMax 2.5 as it is the frontier best model right now to use. And so we'll be going through MiniMax today, going through, uh, actually, you know what? Why don't we just kick things off and I'll go through the agenda. So we'll be going through MiniMax 2.5. What is it? Why you should choose it as a model? I'll go through two real world deployment use cases. One with a knowledge based RAG, which is becoming incredibly popular in enterprise. And then another one regarding document processing. This one's probably going to be one of the most common use cases in companies. If you think about companies and middle office administration or even entry level jobs, a lot of it is really just passing through documents. And so I'll go through that deployment so you guys have the context around that as well. And then lastly, I'll finish off with MiniMax key takeaways. All right, so why MiniMax 2.5? So for those that don't know it, it's a 228 billion parameter model. What does that mean? Well, it's essentially a very big model. It's a very strong model and it predicts incredibly well. It's got an 80.2% SWE bench verified benchmark. What does that mean? Well, if you think about how tokens and models are used most commonly today, what's taking up the majority of token usage? It's software engineering, it's coding, it's debugging. And so the SWE benchmark verified is essentially a set of 500 questions asked to the model to solve. And in this case, MiniMax 2.5 scored 80.2, which is incredibly high. Now, why is it SWE bench verified? Well, previously you had 500 questions, and some of those questions were not even solvable. And so verified is the benchmark where you have 500 questions that are actually solvable, and MiniMax 2.5 could solve 80% of them right off the bat. So that's incredibly strong as a result. And I think the key takeaway for MiniMax 2.5 is its efficiency. It's 13 times cheaper than Opus. That's an incredible magnitude. I mean, you're getting almost the same output, but 13 times less the amount of token used, which equates to you lower cost. And if you think about it from a sustainability point of view, you're also using 13 times less power. And so your carbon footprint's a lot lower as well. So a lot of benefits from a efficiency point of view. Now, when would you choose Claude and when would you choose MiniMax? Well, because MiniMax is so much more computationally more efficient, right? Any agentic tool calling, any office documentation, any cost-sensitive procedures that you're going to throw at a model, MiniMax 2.5 is pretty much your go-to. It's going to reduce your cost significantly. It's going to respond very quickly, and you don't have to worry about the bill at the end of the day. If you think about the use cases for Claude, it might be minutely more accurate, maybe a little bit more, I guess, creative in its thinking, in its results, but you don't really need that if all you're doing is extracting data points from a document. If all you're doing is passing through an incredible amount of documentation to get a result, you don't need the most accurate model by a small difference. So what you need is a model that can do the job incredibly well, very accurately, very quickly, but at the same time, it's cost effective. Now, MiniMax 2.5 on SCX is also self-hosted, so it's not hosted by a US company, it's not offshore. And if you think about using Claude, any data points that you feed into Claude, Opus, or Sonnet, Anthropic essentially has that data point. It knows what you put in, it knows what came out, and it also has a feedback loop on whether or not it answered that correctly. And so if you think about data as an asset, you're really just feeding it across the Claude. Whereas if you're using MiniMax on a sovereign hosted solution, you have control over your data. Essentially, you're not giving out one of the biggest assets of your company being your data set. And so that's another advantage of MiniMax 2.5. Now, if you were doing creative writing, so something that doesn't necessarily matter from a data sensitivity point of view, Opus Sonnet would probably be a pretty good way to go, because it'd probably be just that little bit more innovative. It'd be able to consider things that MiniMax 2.5 maybe doesn't. I also like the software layer kind of Claude provides through its chatbot, so that might be something that you'd utilize. And if you're shooting through images or any screenshots as part of your process, maybe Opus Sonnet is worth the cost, right? Because that is an edge case use case that MiniMax does not cater to out of the box. All right, so let's get into the first use case, the first deployment. So this is a pretty common use case, right? Especially for companies that are in the consulting world. If you think about a professional services firm that in this case has 3 practice areas, but some of the bigger ones have 50, right? You have a lot of siloed teams, and a lot of these consultants are going off to client sites to solve problems. Sometimes they're even going to client sites on secondments, right? It's a heavily regulated industry, and it's very, very disconnected. And so the biggest problem here is all your consultants are out in the field solving problems, but none of that knowledge or solution is then given to the rest of the team. Nobody really has access to it. And I remember when I started at PwC strategy consulting and I was a grad, the first thing they had me do was literally just search through the corpus of slide decks, reach out to 50 different people, asking them, hey, have you encountered this problem before? And if you have, what did you do as a solution? And that's such a big part of these consulting companies, just figuring out if we solved it before, because that could be the shortcut for their client. Now, how do we do that at scale today, and how do we do it better? Because you're spending a tremendous amount of time just searching through documents or asking people if they have the solution. And then there's the gap of you're not going to be able to get through everything. You're not going to be able to reach everyone. Maybe you can't even reach the people because they've left the company. So how do we turn all those documents, those slide decks, those solutions, those assets into something that people in the field could use every day? And so that's essentially the goal. Can we have an interface that could surface accurate answers, accurate solutions that have been previously provided, but at the same time cited, so we know the model's not just hallucinating? And so with that, SEX went in there. We worked with them on a solution. So SEX is not a consulting company. We very much are an infrastructure company. So what we usually do is we help kickstart the project, and then we bring the client's engineering team along in the build. And so in the future, they could deploy these solutions themselves. In this case, we worked with their tech team to essentially centralize that document corpus. It's amazing how many siloed instances of Google Drive, SharePoint, and literally documents on people's laptops there were. So that was the first step. After that, we used SEX's E5 Mistral model to do all the embeddings. So embeddings are essentially turning these documents into a machine-readable format. And I can get into that in more detail if needed, or you could reach out to the team. We could walk you through it. But essentially, we have one of the best embedding models. We have the most accurate. And because it's on our ASIC chips, it runs incredibly quickly. So we embedded all the documents that was in scope, and then we stored it into a vector store. In this case, we use PG Vector. But you use anything you like, really. In this case, because they were on AWS, they used PG Vector. So we stored all the vector stores in there. And what we did was we deployed MiniMax 2.5 as the RAG agent that would interact with all these documents that had been vectorized. And so what the end users got was essentially a method of very quickly and very accurately searching through their corpus to find solutions to the questions their clients had. And it kind of, well, firstly, it solved that problem, but it also kind of upskilled the organization as well, because now when they did workshops or when they had questions of their own or pitch decks that they wanted to access, they now had something they could use that could essentially not only answer the question, but provide them the citation to the source, and provide them with the end pitch deck or the end document that had all the assets they needed to progress an opportunity or to complete and deploy a solution for their client. So it was an incredibly successful project. Now, MiniMax 2.5 specifically did incredibly well because it was incredibly accurate. It answered all these questions quickly, but at the same time, it didn't lose any precision in its output. Furthermore, the clients didn't have to worry about edge cases or use cases where they were using the model too much because it was already 13 times cheaper than Opus and Claude. They didn't have to worry about usage. They didn't have to limit their users on the number of prompts or the number of questions they needed to they could ask. And so MiniMax delivered both from an accuracy point of view, but also from an economics efficiency point of view. Now, as part of the ramp down of the project, we went back and we measured all the benefits of the project, and so we realized there was 72% reduction in search time, and this was, to be completely transparent, done by entry-level engineers or entry-level consultants, and so that was reduced. 94% citation accuracy. The 6% we actually found it's a kind of garbage in, garbage out scenario. If you have documents that are duplicates of other documents, but it was slightly different from an accuracy point of view, that citation might just confuse it a little bit. But 94% they deemed was an accurate citation accuracy that they needed. And it took us 6 weeks of POC to production build. So it wasn't a complicated build either. So that's use case one. Use case two is a pretty common use case, much less complex, but probably very common across financial services, energy companies, and a lot of Australian companies. Any big company that deals with a lot of documents, you're going to have this problem. So in this case, it was the financial services operations teams. They had 200 vendor contracts renewed annually, and this was really just one silo team. There are so many, like there was another team just dealing specifically with invoices. There was another team dealing specifically with statements of advice, but many different documents. In this case, we honed in on this specific niche use case. And so what they needed to do was manually extract key terms, obligations, renewal dates. They'll extract this and put it essentially into a big table for them to analyze. Now, this just took an incredible amount of time. They always had these middle office, what they call analysts, but people that were really just crawling through documents as part of their BAU process. And it was just inaccurate because of manual error, so you had to have people QA it sometimes. And then at the same time, it just took a long time. And so if you had something come in that you needed urgently, the executive would have to email the right people. It was just a mess. And so the goal is really to create an automated pipeline that reads all the contracts, pulls all the structured data and more. So instead of just pulling what you need, pull every data point that's available. And so if you ever went back, you wouldn't have to look at the document again. You always query the database, and then flag any risks associated with their business. Anything according to the use case in a contract should be flagged. Now, as part of this build, we worked with their team to build it specifically on the output because they knew exactly what that table needed to look like. So the first thing was we ingested, and the good thing about this use case was all the data was in one place. But yeah, we ingested all the contracts. We used MiniMax 2.5 directly as the extraction agent. So every contract was pushed to the model, and we asked it for a structured output, a JSON schema for it to respond with. And then we do validation and scoring based on how MiniMax performed, and then it would populate an Excel output that was shared with everyone. In this case, it works out really well because if you think about MiniMax, how accurate it is, but also how token efficient or cost efficient it is, you don't have to worry about the size of document that you're pushing towards it. Actually, in the case where there were too big a document, we just chunk the document and push it that way. And you wouldn't have to worry about the document essentially containing too many words, so the cost will blow out. Because MiniMax is already so cost efficient, it was quite suitable for this use case. Now, this resulted in 85% reduction in review time, 91% extraction accuracy, which is about the same as what they had with their analysts, and because of all the extra data points that were being extracted, that was deemed acceptable. The next phase of it would bring up the accuracy if required. And then they calculated on their end that it was a 340K annualized cost saving on their end just from the FTE reduction, which they didn't reduce, but just in terms of equivalent time saved. But yeah, that was the second use case. I think the second one is a very, very common use case, and I expect pretty much all Australian enterprises to be implementing something similar to that. The first one was a bit more complex, but a much larger value add as it applied to everyone across the business. And they essentially got to interact with a Claude equivalent chatbot with a corpus of content relevant to their company. So quite powerful. But to conclude, when should you go for MiniMax 2.5 and when should you consider alternatives? So when you're looking at a multi-step agentic workflow where there's going to be a lot of tokens consumed just in the thinking process, MiniMax 2.5 should you be your go-to. Office document processing, we've gone through a few use cases relative to that, but essentially any cost-sensitive production loads where you need a very accurate and strong model, but at the same time you don't want to spend an incredible amount of money on it, MiniMax 2.5 is your go-to. And as I said during the presentation, if you're using sensitive data or any data that you don't want American companies or other companies having access to, a sovereign deployed solution is always the go-to, where you have sovereignty over the data assets you're pushing to the model. Consider alternatives when you need multi-model input. So MiniMax doesn't process images out of the box, so you do have to do a customized deployment there. Maybe it's something to do with creative writing or something more innovative. Maybe you're building a rocket, I'm not sure. But anything that really requires state-of-the-art edge case processing and thinking, maybe you could use Claude. Or if you're thinking about something that requires a fine-tuned model, something that needs to respond quickly with the context already in hand, Magpie is a good example of this. You could use a fine-tuned model instead of MiniMax 2.5. And as always, you could reach out to the team. We have a testing endpoint available for you to generate on the website. And you could use MiniMax 2.5 right now just to give it a go. You could do an A/B test, comparing it with the model that you currently used and see if there's actually a difference. I think you'll find, and our customers have found, that MiniMax is incredibly competitive and it's incredibly powerful for the majority of use cases out there. But yeah, with that, I'll open it up to questions. I've got a question here sent through by the moderator. So what is MiniMax's context window? So on SEX, the context window is 160,000. What is the recommended harness for using MiniMax? I mean, I think it is a recommended harness across many different models right now. It's open code. And I mentioned Mistral for embeddings. Are there any other models you've used in conjunction with MiniMax? Yeah, so MiniMax, I think MiniMax's biggest limitation is the fact that out of the box, it doesn't deal with images. And so the proposal has been to use Llama in conjunction with MiniMax for its OCR capability. So you could do image to text for you and then push that output to MiniMax. And so that's a model that you could use in conjunction with MiniMax 2.5. But yeah, I think those are all the questions. It is a Friday morning. I appreciate you guys jumping on. Reach out to the SEX team, myself, or anyone here really. You've got the contact details on the screen. We're always around to help. Thanks for joining me. Have a good day.